David Chen had been looking forward to this day off for weeks. After months of standing guard outside royal palaces and government buildings, he finally had a chance to take care of some personal business. The 22-year-old soldier checked his reflection one last time in his small apartment mirror, making sure every button on his red ceremonial uniform was perfectly aligned. His grandmother had always told him to take pride in his appearance, especially when wearing the uniform. "When you wear those colors," she would say, "you represent something bigger than yourself." Those words echoed in his mind as he straightened his collar and adjusted the ceremonial sword hanging at his side. The walk to Westfield Community Bank took about 15 minutes through the busy downtown streets. David noticed how people looked at him, some with respect, others with curiosity. Children would stop and stare at his tall black hat and shiny boots. A few people even nodded their appreciation or said thank you as he passed by. These small gestures always made him feel proud of his choice to serve. The bank building stood on the corner of Main Street, its large glass windows reflecting the afternoon sun. David had been coming here for almost 3 years, ever since he opened his first checking account as a teenager working part-time jobs to save money for college. Now that college money had been redirected toward helping his family, but he didn't regret his decision to join the Royal Guard instead. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors, the cool air conditioning hit his face, providing relief from the warm spring day outside. The familiar marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the usual mix of customers waited in line or sat at desks conducting business with bank employees. David joined the line behind an elderly woman counting bills in her purse and a businessman typing rapidly on his phone. He pulled out his own phone to check the time. Still plenty of time to get back to the barracks before evening inspection. His commanding officer had been clear about punctuality, especially after their recent deployment to provide security for an international summit. The line moved slowly, giving David time to think about his plans for the rest of his day off. Maybe he'd call his sister, who was starting her final year of medical school. Or perhaps he'd visit his grandmother, who always loved hearing stories about his duties at the palace. She was the only family member who truly understood why he'd chosen military service over university. "Next," called the teller, and David stepped forward with his deposit slip and pay stub ready. The transaction was routine. Deposit his monthly salary, check his account balance, and withdraw some cash for the weekend. He'd done this dozens of times before without any issues, but today felt different from the moment he approached the counter. The young teller, who usually handled his transactions with friendly efficiency, seemed nervous. Her eyes kept darting toward the manager's office, and she spoke in whispers, even though David couldn't understand why. "Is everything all right?" David asked quietly, noticing her unusual behavior. "Oh yes, everything's fine," she replied quickly, but her hands shook slightly as she processed his deposit. "It'll just be a moment." David glanced around the bank, wondering if there was some kind of security concern he should be aware of. His training had taught him to stay alert in public spaces, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The other customers continued their business normally, and the security guard stood in his usual position near the entrance. Then he heard his name being called from across the lobby, but not in a friendly way. "Excuse me, young man in the red uniform." The voice belonged to Mrs. Patricia Wells, the bank manager who had worked there for over 15 years. David had met her once before when he'd had an issue with his account, and she had been professional, if a bit stern. Today, however, her tone carried an edge that made several other customers turn to look. David walked over to her desk, assuming she needed to verify something about his account, or perhaps had a question about his military service. Some bank employees were curious about what it was really like to guard important buildings and meet dignitaries. "Yes, ma'am. Is there something I can help you with?" Mrs. Wells stood up from behind her desk, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she looked him up and down with obvious disapproval. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her dark blue suit made her appear even more intimidating than usual. "I need to ask you some questions about that uniform you're wearing," she said loudly enough that other customers began to pay attention. David felt confused but remained polite. "Of course. What would you like to know?" "Where exactly did you get it?" The question caught him off guard. From the military supply office, ma'am. When I completed my training and was assigned to the household regiment. Mrs. Wells crossed her arms and shook her head. I find that very hard to believe. You look far too young to be in any real military position, especially one that would require such an elaborate costume. The word costume hit David like a slap. He felt his face flush with embarrassment as he realized what was happening. Several customers had now stopped what they were doing to watch the conversation unfold. Ma'am, this isn't a costume. I'm a serving member of the Royal Guard. I have my identification if you'd like to see it. Oh, I'm sure you have fake identification too, Mrs. Wells replied, with a dismissive wave of her hand. Do you have any idea how many people come in here trying to scam us with fake military stories? They dress up in uniforms bought online and expect special treatment or sympathy. David reached for his wallet, pulling out his military ID card, driver's license, and the same bank card he'd been using for years. Please just look at these, you'll see that everything is legitimate. But Mrs. Wells barely glanced at the documents before pushing them back toward him. Anyone can fake these things nowadays. What I can't understand is why someone your age would think they could pull off such an obvious lie. The conversation was getting louder, and David could see people starting to pull out their phones. Some were recording, probably expecting to witness the exposure of someone pretending to be a soldier. The attention made him feel sick to his stomach. I've been banking here for 3 years, David said, trying to keep his voice steady. Your own teller just processed my military pay deposit. Surely that proves something. What it proves, Mrs. Wells announced loud enough for half the bank to hear, is that you're either very good at forging documents or you're involved in some kind of fraud scheme. Real soldiers don't look like they just stepped out of a movie. David felt the weight of every eye in the bank on him. The elderly woman from the line was shaking her head disapprovingly. The businessman had stopped typing and was openly staring. Even the security guard was watching the scene unfold with interest. Ma'am, I understand your concern about fraud, but I promise you, I'm telling the truth. I can call my commanding officer, right now if that would help. Don't bother, Mrs. Wells replied coldly. I've made up my mind. I want you to leave this bank immediately, and I'm calling the police to report this incident. We take stolen valor very seriously here. The words, stolen valor, seemed to echo through the marble lobby. David felt his world spinning as he realized that no matter what he said or what proof he offered, this woman had already decided he was a fraud. The uniform he wore with such pride, the service he had dedicated his young life to, was being dismissed as an elaborate lie. As Mrs. Wells reached for her phone, David stood frozen in the middle of the bank lobby, surrounded by strangers who now saw him as a con artist rather than the dedicated soldier he truly was. David's hands trembled slightly as he watched Mrs. Wells pick up her desk phone. The sound of the dial tone seemed to echo through the entire bank lobby, and he felt his stomach drop. This was really happening. She was actually calling the police on him. Hello, this is Patricia Wells at Westfield Community Bank. She spoke into the receiver, her voice carrying clearly across the marble floor. I need to report someone impersonating a military officer. Yes, he's here right now, wearing what appears to be a fake uniform. The words hit David like physical blows. Around him, the other customers were no longer pretending to mind their own business. Phones were openly pointed in his direction now, recording what everyone assumed would be the dramatic arrest of a military imposter. He could already imagine the videos appearing online with titles like Fake Soldier Exposed at Bank or Military Imposter Gets What He Deserves. Please, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're making a terrible mistake. Mrs. Wells covered the phone's mouthpiece and looked at him with disgust. The only mistake here was thinking you could fool people with that ridiculous act. Look at yourself. You're practically shaking. Real soldiers don't fall apart this easily. But David wasn't shaking from fear of being caught in a lie. He was shaking from the overwhelming injustice of the situation, from watching his reputation and honor being destroyed by someone who refused to listen to reason. Every value his grandmother had taught him about dignity and service was being trampled in front of a crowd of strangers. The teller who had processed his deposit earlier looked mortified. She kept glancing between David and her manager, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding. She had seen his military pay stub, had processed his legitimate banking for months, but she was too junior to challenge her boss in front of customers. "Ma'am?" The teller finally spoke up quietly. "His account information shows regular military deposits, and I've processed his transactions before." "Don't be naive, Linda," Mrs. Wells snapped, still holding the phone. "Fraudsters are getting more sophisticated these days. They create fake pay stubs, fake accounts, the whole thing. I've seen it all before." David felt a surge of gratitude toward Linda for at least trying to defend him, even though her effort was quickly dismissed. It reminded him that not everyone in the bank had decided he was guilty without evidence. An older gentleman who had been waiting in line approached David cautiously. For a moment, David hoped someone would speak up for him, someone who might recognize that he was telling the truth. "Son," the man said quietly, "I served in Vietnam back in the day. That uniform you're wearing, it's very impressive. Almost too impressive, if you know what I mean." David's heart sank further. Even this veteran was doubting him. "Sir, I understand your concern, but I promise you, this uniform was issued to me by the military. I've earned the right to wear it." The older man shook his head sadly. "Real military uniforms get worn out, son. They get dirty, faded, beat up from actual use. Yours looks like it just came off a store rack. No creases, no wear marks, nothing that shows you've actually done any real military work." This observation sparked murmurs of agreement from other customers. David realized with growing horror that his attention to proper uniform maintenance, something that was drilled into every guard during training, was now being used as evidence against him. "We're required to keep our dress uniforms in perfect condition," David explained desperately. "We have regular inspections. If my uniform looked worn out, I'd be disciplined." "Sure you would," Mrs. Wells said sarcastically, finally hanging up the phone. "The police are on their way. They'll sort this whole thing out." The word police seemed to energize the crowd. More people were recording now, and David could hear whispered conversations speculating about what would happen when the officers arrived. Some people seemed excited about witnessing what they believed would be a dramatic arrest. A young woman with her toddler in tow moved away from David, pulling her child closer as if he posed some kind of danger. The look of suspicion and fear in her eyes cut deeper than anything Mrs. Wells had said. In her mind, he had gone from being a protector to being a threat in the span of minutes. "Mommy, why is everyone looking at that soldier?" the little boy asked innocently. "He's not a real soldier, honey," the mother replied loud enough for David to hear. "He's just pretending to be one." David closed his eyes for a moment, trying to compose himself. He thought about his training, about the countless hours he'd spent learning to remain calm under pressure. But nothing had prepared him for this type of pressure, the weight of public humiliation and false accusations. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his sister asking if he wanted to have dinner later that week. The normalcy of the message felt surreal given his current situation. In a few hours, when videos of this incident went viral, his sister would probably see them. His grandmother might see them. His fellow guards would definitely see them. The security guard, a middle-aged man named Frank, who David had chatted with during previous visits, approached hesitantly. David had always liked Frank, who often shared stories about his own son in the military. "Listen, kid," Frank said quietly, "I don't want to see you get into more trouble than you're already in. Why don't you just admit what's going on here? Maybe people will go easier on you if you come clean now." Even Frank, who had always been friendly, now believed he was a fraud. David felt completely alone in a room full of people. "Frank, you've seen me here dozens of times. You know I'm not some random person who walked in off the street." Frank shifted uncomfortably. "I've seen you here, sure, but I never really paid attention to whether that uniform was real or not. Now that Mrs. Wells has pointed it out, I have to admit, it does seem pretty suspicious." Mrs. Wells was now talking to other employees, probably briefing them on the situation and warning them to watch for similar scams in the future. David could see her gesturing in his direction and shaking her head, clearly painting him as part of some elaborate criminal scheme. The bank's atmosphere had completely changed. What had been a quiet, professional environment was now charged with tension and excitement. People were no longer conducting their normal business. Everyone was focused on the drama unfolding in the lobby. David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, looking for his commanding officers. Number. Maybe if Major Harrison spoke to these people directly, they would finally believe the truth. But as he started to dial, Mrs. Wells noticed what he was doing. "Oh, no, you don't," she said sharply, walking over to him. "You're not calling your accomplices or warning anyone about what's happening here. Put that phone away right now." "I'm trying to call my commanding officer to verify my identity," David protested. "I'm sure you are," Mrs. Wells replied with heavy sarcasm. "And I'm sure whoever answers will have a very convincing story prepared. That's how these scams work. Everyone involved has their story straight." David felt trapped. Every attempt to prove his innocence was being interpreted as further evidence of his guilt. The logical explanations that should have cleared up the misunderstanding were instead being twisted to fit Mrs. Wells's predetermined conclusion that he was a fraud. Through the bank's large windows, he could see a police car pulling into the parking lot, its lights flashing but no siren. The sight made his knees feel weak. In a few minutes, police officers would walk through those doors, and Mrs. Wells would tell them her version of events. Would they listen to his side of the story? Or would they also assume that a young man in a perfect uniform had to be lying? The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the climax of their entertainment was approaching. David stood in the center of it all, still holding his phone, still hoping that somehow this nightmare would end before it got any worse. David watched through the glass doors as two police officers stepped out of their patrol car. His mouth went dry as he realized this humiliating situation was about to get much worse. The taller officer was adjusting his duty belt while the shorter one was already scanning the bank's interior through the windows. In a few seconds, they would walk through those doors, and Mrs. Wells would tell them her version of the story. The crowd inside the bank seemed to sense that the main event was about to begin. More phones came out, positioned to capture what everyone expected would be the dramatic arrest of a military imposter. David could hear whispered comments behind him, people speculating about how long he might go to jail, or wondering how he thought he could get away with such an obvious scam. "This is it," Mrs. Wells announced with satisfaction, smoothing down her suit jacket. "The officers are here. We'll get this sorted out once and for all." David's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. Should he make one more attempt to call Major Harrison? Should he just wait quietly and hope the police would listen to his side of the story? Every option seemed hopeless at this point. Just as the police officers reached for the door handles, something unexpected happened. A black sedan pulled up quickly behind the patrol car, its tires screeching slightly as it came to an abrupt stop. The driver's door flew open with such force that it made a loud bang when it hit its limit. Everyone in the bank turned to look as a tall figure in military dress uniform emerged from the sedan. Even through the glass, it was obvious that this person was different from David. Where David looked young and uncertain, this man radiated authority and experience. His uniform was identical to David's, but worn with the confidence that only comes from years of service. The man's face was set in an expression of barely controlled fury as he strode toward the bank entrance. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his shoulders were broad from decades of military training, and his chest displayed rows of ribbons and medals that spoke of real combat experience and distinguished service. Major William Harrison had been driving back to the base from a meeting with government officials when he received an urgent call from one of his contacts. Someone had seen videos being posted online of one of his guardsmen being humiliated at a local bank. The major had immediately changed course and driven straight to Westfield Community Bank, his anger building with every mile. The police officers who had been about to enter the bank stopped and stepped aside respectfully as they recognized the approach of a senior military officer. The major acknowledged them with a brief nod, but didn't slow his pace toward the entrance. Inside the bank, the atmosphere changed instantly. The excited chatter died down as people realized they were about to witness something they hadn't expected. This wasn't just another customer. This was clearly someone important, someone with real authority. Mrs. Wells, who had been preparing to give her statement to the police, suddenly looked less confident. Her eyes widened as she took in the imposing figure approaching the doors. Even she could tell the difference between David's youthful appearance and this man's obvious military bearing. The major pushed through the glass doors with such purpose that they seemed to get out of his way. The sound of his polished boots on the marble floor cut through the silence like gunshots. Every conversation stopped, every phone camera turned in his direction, and even the small children in the bank seemed to sense that something significant was happening. "Chen!" The major's voice boomed across the bank lobby with the kind of authority that made everyone in the building stand a little straighter. What in blazes is going on here? David felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly made his knees buckle. Finally, someone who knew the truth had arrived. Someone who could end this nightmare. "Major Harrison, sir," David responded automatically, his military training taking over as he snapped to attention despite being surrounded by hostile civilians. "There's been a misunderstanding about my uniform and service record, sir." The major's steel-gray eyes swept the scene, taking in the recording phones, the uncomfortable police officers still standing outside, and the crowd of bank customers who suddenly looked like they weren't sure what they had stumbled into. His gaze finally settled on Mrs. Wells, who was now standing behind her desk looking significantly less sure of herself. "A misunderstanding," the major repeated, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the bank. "Is that what we're calling it?" He began walking toward Mrs. Wells's desk, and David noticed that several customers instinctively stepped out of his way. This was a man who was used to having his presence respected, and even civilians could sense his authority. "You," the major said, pointing directly at Mrs. Wells. "Are you the person responsible for this situation?" Mrs. Wells tried to maintain her earlier confidence, but her voice wavered slightly when she answered. "I am the bank manager, yes. I was doing my job by identifying what appeared to be a case of stolen valor and military impersonation." "Appeared to be," the major repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "Based on what evidence, exactly?" "Well, he looks very young and his uniform is too perfect and," Mrs. Wells began, but her argument sounded much weaker now than they had 15 minutes earlier. The major held up his hand, silencing her. "Before you continue, let me introduce myself. I am Major William Harrison of the Household Regiment, and I have been Guardsman Chen's commanding officer for the past 18 months. The effect of his words on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. The excited energy that had filled the bank suddenly turned into uncomfortable silence. People who had been eagerly recording what they thought was the exposure of a fraud now realized they might have been witnessing something very different. "Guardsman Chen," the major continued, never taking his eyes off Mrs. Wells, "has served with distinction in multiple assignments. He has stood guard at royal residences, provided security for state functions, and conducted himself with honor in every duty I have assigned him." David felt his eyes well up with tears of gratitude and relief. After nearly an hour of having his service and honor questioned by strangers, hearing his commanding officer defend him publicly was overwhelming. The major stepped closer to Mrs. Wells's desk, and his voice dropped to a tone that was somehow more intimidating than his earlier booming commands. "This young man has earned the right to wear that uniform through months of rigorous training, dedication to duty and service to his country. He maintains his uniform in perfect condition because that is what we expect of our guardsmen. He looks young because he is young, barely 22 years old and already serving with more honor and dignity than has been shown in this bank today." Mrs. Wells had gone completely pale. Around the lobby, customers were starting to lower their phones, and some were looking genuinely ashamed of their earlier enthusiasm for what they now realized had been a terrible mistake. The police officers, who had finally entered the bank, were standing near the entrance looking uncertain about their role in what was clearly a very different situation than they had been told to expect. Furthermore, Major Harrison continued, his voice rising again, "Your assumption that military service can be judged by appearance alone is not only ignorant, it is insulting to every man and woman who has ever worn their nation's uniform." The major turned slightly to address the entire bank, making sure his words reached everyone who had witnessed David's humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have seen here today is not the exposure of a fraud, but the shameful treatment of A genuine hero by someone too prejudiced and stubborn to recognize honor when it stood directly in front of her. The silence in the bank was so complete that David could hear his own heartbeat. Major Harrison stood like a stone wall between him and Mrs. Wells, his presence filling the entire lobby with an authority that no one dared to challenge. The bank manager, who had been so confident just minutes before, now looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "Now then," Major Harrison said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I believe you owe Guardsman Chen an explanation for this disgraceful display." Mrs. Wells opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find words that might somehow justify what she had done. The crowd of customers who had been so eager to record David's supposed exposure were now shifting uncomfortably, many of them lowering their phones entirely. I was just doing my job," she finally managed to say, her voice much quieter than before. "We've had problems with people trying to scam us by pretending to be military personnel." Major Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so? And in your professional opinion, what qualifications do you have to determine the authenticity of a military uniform or the legitimacy of someone's service record?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Wells looked around the lobby, as if hoping someone might help her, but everyone was watching in silence. "Well, I've seen fake uniforms before, and his looked too new, too perfect." "Too perfect," Major Harrison repeated slowly, turning the words over as if they tasted bitter. "Let me explain something to you about military standards, Mrs. Wells. In the household regiment, we inspect our guardsmen's uniforms every single day. If Guardsman Chen appeared for duty with a wrinkled shirt, scuffed boots, or a crooked badge, he would face disciplinary action." He gestured toward David, who still stood at attention despite the civilian setting. "This young man spends 30 minutes every morning ensuring his uniform meets our standards. He polishes his boots until they shine. He presses every crease until it's razor sharp, and he checks every button and buckle before leaving his quarters. That's not suspicious behavior. That's the mark of a dedicated professional." David felt a surge of pride hearing his commanding officer describe his daily routine in such positive terms. All those early mornings spent preparing his uniform, all the attention to detail that had been drilled into him during training, it was validation that his efforts mattered. The elderly veteran who had earlier questioned David's uniform now stepped forward, looking deeply embarrassed. "Major, I owe this young man an apology. I served in Vietnam, and I thought I knew what a real soldier looked like. I was wrong to doubt him." Major Harrison nodded respectfully to the older man. "Your service is honored, sir. But times change, and so do uniforms and procedures. What hasn't changed is the dedication and sacrifice of those who choose to serve." He turned back to Mrs. Wells, who was now visibly trembling. "What particularly disturbs me about this situation is not just your incorrect assumptions, but your complete refusal to listen when Guardsman Chen attempted to provide proof of his service. He offered to show you his identification. He offered to contact his commanding officer, and you dismissed every piece of evidence without consideration." "I thought the documents might be fake," Mrs. Wells said weakly. "You thought," Major Harrison repeated with obvious displeasure. "You didn't verify. You didn't investigate. You simply decided based on your personal prejudices that a young man couldn't possibly be a legitimate member of the armed forces." Linda, the teller who had processed David's deposit, finally found the courage to speak up. "Ma'am, I tried to tell you that his account showed regular military pay deposits and that I'd handled his transactions before." Mrs. Wells shot her employee a sharp look, but Major Harrison intervened before she could respond. "Thank you, miss. It's refreshing to see that at least one person in this establishment was willing to consider the facts." He looked back at Mrs. Wells. "Your own employee tried to defend this guardsman's reputation, and you silenced her. That tells me everything I need to know about your management style and your respect for the truth." The police officers, who had been standing uncertainly near the entrance, finally approached. The senior officer, a sergeant with graying hair, addressed Major Harrison respectfully. "Major, we received a call about someone impersonating a military officer. I take it the situation has been resolved?" Major Harrison's expression remained stern. "The situation, Sergeant, is that one of my guardsmen was publicly humiliated, and falsely accused by someone who couldn't be bothered to verify her claims before calling you. There was never any impersonation, only ignorance and prejudice, the T. Police Sergeant nodded, understanding. We see a lot of stolen valor cases, but we also know how to recognize the real thing. Your guardsman's bearing and your testimony make it clear we were called under false pretenses. False pretenses, Major Harrison agreed. And now I want to address the broader implications of what happened here today. He turned to face the crowd of customers, many of whom were now looking ashamed of their earlier behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand something. Military service members, whether they're 18 or 80, whether they're brand new recruits or decorated veterans, deserve your respect and consideration. They don't deserve to be treated like criminals simply because they're young or because they take pride in their appearance. Frank, the security guard who had known David for years but had still doubted him, stepped forward with his head down. Major, I owe this young man an apology too. I've chatted with him dozens of times and I should have stood up for him. I let the crowd mentality get to me and that's not right. At least you're man enough to admit your mistake, Major Harrison replied. That's more than can be said for some people here today. His gaze returned to Mrs. Wells, who was now sitting in her chair, looking smaller than she had when this whole ordeal began. Now, Mrs. Wells, I believe you have something to say to Guardsman Chen, a public apology for the public humiliation you caused him. Mrs. Wells looked up, and for the first time, David could see genuine remorse in her eyes. The reality of what she had done, the damage she had caused to an innocent person, was finally sinking in. Guardsman Chen, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I owe you a sincere apology. I was wrong to doubt your service, wrong to refuse to listen to your explanations, and wrong to subject you to public humiliation. I let my assumptions override the facts, and I'm deeply sorry. David nodded stiffly, accepting the apology with more grace than she had shown him. Thank you, ma'am, but Major Harrison wasn't finished. Mrs. Wells, I want you to understand that this young man will return to his duties tonight, and he will continue to serve his country with honor, despite the treatment he received here today. But the memory of this incident will stay with him, and it will stay with everyone who witnessed it. He paused, letting his words sink in. I will be contacting your corporate headquarters to discuss how one of their managers handled a situation involving a service member. This kind of treatment is unacceptable, and there need to be consequences. The threat hung in the air, and Mrs. Wells nodded silently, understanding that her career might well be in jeopardy because of her actions today. Around the lobby, customers were beginning to approach David, offering their own apologies and thanks for his service. The tide had turned completely. The atmosphere in the bank had completely transformed. Where there had been tension and hostility just minutes before, now there was an almost reverent quiet as people began to truly understand what they had witnessed. David stood straighter, now his confidence slowly returning as he watched the crowd's attitude shift from suspicion to respect. The first person to approach him was an elderly woman who had been waiting in line when the whole incident began. She walked slowly, using a cane, and her eyes were filled with genuine remorse. Young man, she said softly, reaching out to gently touch his arm. I am so very sorry. My late husband served in Korea, and he would be ashamed of how I behaved today. Thank you for your service, and please forgive an old woman's foolishness. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. There's nothing to forgive, ma'am. I understand how the situation must have looked. Behind her, the businessman who had been typing on his phone earlier stepped forward. I recorded some of what happened on my phone, he said quietly. I was planning to post it online, but now I've deleted everything. No one should have to go through what you just experienced. One by one, other customers began approaching David. Parents with children explained to their kids about respect for military service. Teenagers who had been snickering earlier now looked embarrassed and offered sincere apologies. The young mother who had pulled her child away from David brought her toddler back over. I'm sorry for judging you, she said. My brother is in the army, and I should have known better. Can my son shake hands with a real soldier? The little boy, no longer afraid, reached up with tiny fingers to touch the shiny buttons on David's uniform. Are you really a soldier? he asked with wide eyes. I am, David replied, kneeling down to the child's level. I help protect important people and buildings. That's so cool, the boy exclaimed, his excitement genuine and infectious. Major Harrison watched these interactions with satisfaction, but his attention kept returning to Mrs. Wells, who remained seated at her desk looking devastated. The full weight of her mistake was clearly hitting her, and she seemed to age years in the span of minutes. Mrs. Wells, Major Harrison said, his tone slightly softer but still firm, I hope you'll learn something valuable from today's events. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. I already have, Major. I've been a bank manager for 15 years and I thought I was good at reading people. Today showed me how wrong I can be and how much damage my assumptions can cause. The damage isn't just to Guardsman Chen, Major Harrison pointed out. It's to your own reputation, to this bank's reputation, and to the trust that should exist between civilians and military personnel. Linda, the teller, had been watching everything unfold with obvious relief that the truth had finally come out. She approached her manager hesitantly. Mrs. Wells, I know this isn't the right time, but I want you to know that David, Guardsman Chen, has been one of our most polite and professional customers for years. He always says please and thank you, he's patient when there are delays, and he's never once asked for special treatment because of his uniform. Mrs. Wells nodded slowly. That makes this even worse, doesn't it? I attacked the character of someone who had never given me any reason to doubt him. The police sergeant, who had been quietly observing the resolution of the situation, approached Major Harrison. Major, we appreciate you coming down here to clear this up. Cases like this can get complicated fast, especially with social media involved. Speaking of social media, Major Harrison said, raising his voice slightly to address the entire bank, I want everyone here to understand something. What happened today was recorded by multiple people. Those videos will likely end up online, whether we want them to or not. When they do, I hope they tell the complete story, not just the accusation but the resolution, not just the mistake but the apologies and the lessons learned. A teenager who had been recording earlier held up his phone. Major, I got most of what happened on video. Would it be okay if I posted it? I think people need to see how this turned out. Major Harrison looked at David, who nodded slightly. If you post it, make sure you include everything. Show how quickly people jumped to conclusions, but also show how they were willing to admit they were wrong when they learned the truth. The teen nodded seriously. I will. This whole thing taught me not to judge people so fast. Frank, the security guard, approached David with obvious shame written across his face. David, I've known you for 3 years. I've watched you grow from a nervous teenager opening his first bank account to the confident young man you are today. I should have trusted what I knew about your character instead of getting caught up in the crowd. I'm truly sorry. David shook Frank's offered hand. Frank, I understand. When everyone around you is saying the same thing, it's hard not to get swept along. What matters is that you're willing to admit it and apologize. That's very mature of you, Frank replied. Your parents raised you right. My grandmother, David corrected with a small smile. She always told me that how you treat people in difficult situations shows who you really are. Major Harrison overheard this comment and smiled for the first time since entering the bank. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. I'd like to meet her sometime. She'd love that, sir. She's very proud of my service. As she should be, Major Harrison replied. Then addressing the bank as a whole, he continued. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to leave you with something to think about. Military service members are your neighbors, your family members, your friends. They come in all ages, all backgrounds, all appearances. Some are grizzled veterans with decades of experience. Others are young people like Guardsman Chen who chose service over other paths in life. He gestured toward David. This young man could have gone to college, could have taken a job in the private sector, could have chosen any number of easier paths. Instead, he chose to dedicate years of his life to serving others. That choice deserves respect, not suspicion. An older man who had been quietly watching everything stepped forward. Major, I want to thank you for coming here today. I'm a veteran. Myself, Navy, and what I witnessed here reminded me why it's so important for us to stick up for each other. Thank you for your service, Major Harrison replied. And you're absolutely right. We need to support each other both in uniform and out. Mrs. Wells stood up slowly from her desk. Major, Guardsman Chen, I know my apology isn't enough to undo what happened here today, but I want you to know that I'm going to use this experience to train our staff better. No service member should ever face what happened here again. Not in my bank. That would be a positive outcome from a negative situation, Major Harrison acknowledged. As the crowd began to disperse and normal banking operations slowly resumed, David completed the transaction he had originally come to do. Linda processed his deposit with extra care and attention, making sure everything was perfect. David, she said quietly as she handed him his receipt, I want you to know that you've always been welcome here, and you always will be. Today was an aberration, not a reflection of how we really feel about our military customers. Thank you, Linda. That means a lot. As David and Major Harrison prepared to leave the bank, the atmosphere had completely changed from when David had first walked in. People nodded respectfully as they passed, children waved, and the staff wished them well. Outside in the parking lot, Major Harrison placed a hand on David's shoulder. You handled that situation with remarkable dignity, Chen. A lesser person might have lost their temper or given up trying to prove their innocence. My grandmother always taught me that your character shows most clearly when you're under pressure, David replied. I tried to remember that. She taught you well. Now let's get you back to base. We have a ceremony tomorrow, and after today's events, I want you to wear that uniform with even more pride than usual. As they drove away from the bank, David reflected on the day's events. It had started as a simple banking errand and turned into one of the most challenging experiences of his life. But it had also shown him the power of standing up for what's right, the importance of having people who believe in you, and the fact that truth and justice can prevail even in the darkest moments. The story of what happened at Westfield Community Bank that day would indeed spread online, but not in the way anyone had originally expected. Instead of a video showing a fake soldier being exposed, it became a powerful reminder about the dangers of jumping to conclusions and the importance of treating all service members with the respect they have earned.